Hey everyone, welcome back. This is our second episode of the Odyssey Podcast. First episode was a success, apart from the many technical difficulties we had. So there was a few, right? Your video stopped obviously at the end when we had to cut it, but there was like a little blip halfway through as well where we almost lost it, but it kind of came back.
Oh, yeah. I had forgotten about that. I thought you were referring to like the half an hour beforehand where I was trying
Oh,
to get this new camera to work. And it turns out the increase in video quality is
minimal.
questionable. Yeah.
There was that, and I had to learn how to use Premiere Pro. Got the rendering wrong, so it was a 24-hour process, but we got there.
Big
People
success.
people seem to enjoy it, so here we are, episode 2. We've got some questions to answer. We've got some stuff to generally talk about. Is there anything you wanted to jump in with, or will we jump in with the questions to start?
No, let's go. Let's go for the questions.
Okay, so first couple of questions. It's kind of double pronged. First one is, what makes a good athlete? So it's a pretty general question. I suppose we'll obviously speak about it, with regards to powerlifting. But what do you think makes a good athlete?
I think somebody who's patient is the most important thing, because it's regardless, it's a super long process. And whether you're talking about training for powerlifting, or I suppose a closely related goal could be training for muscle growth, it takes a super long time, and you need to be patient and kind of trust not only the process that you've set out in the short term, but you have to trust that this process will emerge over time. You need to kind of follow the trail of athlete response, as we call it. Like sometimes it'll take you down some great training, and sometimes it won't, and you need to be like, okay, that happened, and that's necessary, that's needed, and I think most other qualities that you could call like really good for an athlete will develop over time if you have that patience. Like you could say hard work, you could say they have this. I referred to a quote in the RTS manual recently of being controlled aggressive, so that you're controlled enough to stay with the stress level you've been prescribed, so that if you're prescribed a 3 at 8, you're not going for 3 at 9 or 3 at 10 even. And aggressive in the sense that you need to hit your, or be your prescribed internal stress, I should say, sorry. And that if you're undershooting the whole time, that's progress and adaptation left on the table. So it's a weird balance between the two. I think that can be learned. I think people, for the most part, tend to one side or another. I'd be quite conservative, but I think patience is the utmost thing. Absolutely.
I think I would agree in some sense, but I think open-mindedness kind of might jump in above patience almost. I think a lot of what generally a lot of the traits we generally would talk about constituting a good athlete are largely influenced by genetic markers. Like your patience isn't going to be something like, you take a really patient person, someone who's just patient by nature, and someone who's not patient. They can both be fantastic athletes. This is where the coach-athlete relationship comes in. It's on the coach in that instance to understand the person you're working with is not the most patient person you've ever worked with before. So what makes up a good athlete? Someone who's willing to work with the coach to solve the issues that are presented in front of them. And those issues might be caused by your lack of patience. That does not mean you are a bad athlete. You might not want to do 4 backdowns after every set. Some people would look at that and they'd be like, that's a lazy athlete, But that's not the case. And oftentimes these narratives are placed in athletes' mind, like, you have to work harder, you have to be more patient, you have to hold more of this quality that you don't just inherently hold to be a better athlete. When no, like, communicate openly with your coach, be open-minded, communicate honestly about your thoughts on their solutions to the problems that are presented, and do that forever. That, I think, in essence, in my experience as well, is what makes a good athlete. Those are the athletes I personally enjoy working with the most, are the ones who are most open to the conversation that is the coach-athlete relationship.
Yeah, I can't really argue with that now, to be honest. You made a lot of good points. And it is a conversation, and you need to, what you said on about, like, let's say backdowns, for example, and communicating openly and honestly is super important. Like, how many times have you worked with somebody and you think, yeah, everything's going great, then a couple of weeks later they're like, Adam, I'm gonna park this for a while, I'm not really loving that, and you're like, you said everything was great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I suppose, yeah, you need to be open-minded and honest, because we're not mind readers. Like,
This is it. We're not mind readers, and we also don't expect you to be robots, uh, and I think every coach should be mindful that they're working with people.
absolutely.
A quote I like to throw around, I think I came up with it. I don't know. I credit myself with this quote anyways. Powerlifting is really simple. We're talking about 3 lifts and these really easy to control variables. People are very, very complicated. I suppose that is what we look to address with our approach to coaching powerlifting. We keep what is simple very simple, and we dive into the complexities of people. And that can often present itself to the uninitiated as like complicated training, but no, it's always going to be some competition derivative with some reps at some RPE with some volume. It's always the same. The complexities of the person that we're working with will dictate the actual structure of the training itself. Yeah.
I think the quote is too good for you to have come up with it.
I don't think I actually finished the quote, did I? The quote is, anyway, powerlifting is simple, people are complex. And
yeah, no, you said that. Yeah,
I wish everyone kept that in mind.
that's true, and it's a slight tangent, but I was only thinking about yesterday how important soft skills are, and how stupid a name soft skills is, because they're so important. I was on I suppose a webinar, you call it, with Dr. Jacob Harden and Quinn Hennock a couple of weeks ago, and he was describing his approach to rehabbing a really high level CrossFit athlete, and he described it as like it was one part like behavioral change and one part like specific strength conditioning, and like even at that highest level, it's still about working with the person and kind of seeing how they think about something and addressing that.
Mm-hmm.
And as you alluded to there, it's tough when it's a human being that you're working with and not a machine that you can plug in whatever variable you want and it'll give this expected or predetermined response. And working with the person is the hard part, And so soft skills is a dumb name. It's like, it's so important.
Mm-hmm. I agree. That kind of leads us perfectly into the next question, which I came up with, is what qualities make a good powerlifting coach?
Do you want to start off with this one?
Yeah. I think the most important quality a powerlifting coach, and probably any coach or anyone in a position where you're working directly and influencing people, is empathy. At least that's been my answer to that question. Any other time I've answered it, I think the ability to try and put yourself in someone's shoes and understand where they're coming from on all things coaching is really, really important. And beyond that, like I mentioned with what makes a good athlete, you could probably have every and any combination of personality traits and still find great success as a powerlifting coach, as long as you have that underlying empathy, you know. At least that's what would make a good powerlifting coach in my eyes, you know. I'm sure there are other people who maybe don't want, for whatever reason, that much empathy in their training. There are certain people who just want to be told what to do, you know. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But yeah, I think empathy is the most important trait.
I think where that comes really into play is in using a bottoms-up approach where the long-term strategy develops from the short term. Interacting with the human being is the most important part, because that's where you're getting your information. But if you're coming at it from a top-down approach, let's say like we have a meet in 12 months, nationals is in 12 months. You're going to do a 4-week peak and scale backwards from that until today. When a plan like that is laid out, which to me is inherently inflexible, it's almost like being empathetic and responding to the lifter disrupts that plan. Whereas if you have a bottoms-up approach, the lifter is the plan, but you get what I mean. And so you need to be empathetic in that scenario, you know?
Yeah.
And I've seen the inverse of it so many times, and it really pisses me off, to be honest, where that if the lifter doesn't respond to your predetermined plan that was built entirely out of assumptions, when things don't go well, the blame is on the lifter. And it's their fault. They didn't work hard enough, or they didn't do this, or they didn't do that. Do you get me? And
Totally. It's something that pisses me off. I wrote a blog post around 9 months ago or so called "Peaking is Supposed to Hurt," and it's easier to communicate through text that I don't think that statement is true, because I do the cap lock lowercase, cap lock lowercase typing. I don't actually know what the inflection that is supposed to denote is, but it makes it obvious that it's a mocking statement. Yeah, peaking is supposed to hurt is a statement that I don't think it's thrown around as much anymore, which is a fantastic thing. I'm delighted to hear it. But when I first got into the sport 6 or 7 years ago, it was like peaking was this mystical thing that
it was a law. That's what happened.
Yeah,
when it didn't happen, you're like, what am I doing wrong?
It's supposed to hurt. If it doesn't hurt, you're probably not peaking. You're supposed to add 150 kilos to your total. It was this thing again because of the dominance of a top-down approach at the time, and these Russian peaking programs. The coach would expect that the athlete performs this peaking program at all costs, and if you're, like you said, they're inflexible. They're inherently inflexible, and unlike a bottoms-up approach where you're kind of rewarded for being flexible in the long term, there's no reward coming from being flexible with this top-down approach, peaking approach, or at least that's what the peaking is supposed to hurt thing suggests. But yeah, I think placing blame on the athlete is something that really just bugs me. I think it bugs you as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's again ties back into empathy,
To me, it's a real sign of just an insecure, immature, and I suppose probably an inexperienced coach. Mm-hmm. That if you're so afraid to take responsibility for the decisions that you made, that you're going to say, nope, this is on you, bud. You fucked up in some way.
especially if you're aware of both sides of the coin. If you're aware of the bottoms up approach and you're aware of the top down approach, but you select the top down approach, you can't hide behind the weaknesses of the top down approach then. You selected it for a reason. You can't say individualized training, use a top down approach, and then if the top down approach doesn't go to plan, you can't then fall back and hide behind the weaknesses that you were aware of. You know what I mean? Like, use a bottoms up approach. If you want to market individualization, then I think you really need an athlete-centric approach. And I think we both agree that it's really not possible to have a truly athlete-centric approach with a top-down structure.
Absolutely. This is such a dynamic process. And the only excuse that I've heard from coaches who use a top-down approach is that, oh, this whatever X length of time training period, this worked really well for Adam, so it must be you that's not doing it right. And it's like that, like, falls at the very first hurdle. It's like, is this Adam? It's like, no. Then how could you make that assumption? Mm-hmm. And even if you said, oh, well, this worked last year for you, it's like, yeah, no, that's something that really pisses me off, to be honest, because it's, and as you said, when you're aware of the alternative, what's the issue? It's not difficult. It's nearly fucking easier because you don't need to plan out something of ridiculous length. You're responding to the data that's being provided. And it may not be in the form of like stats and figures. It may be, I suppose, what I would call like soft data points. Like, oh, on the 5th week of every block, the lifter wants to quit, wants to fucking give up the sport, is in bits, niggles, pains, and aches. Like, okay, so maybe let's not put blocks more than 5 weeks. Scale it back to 4 weeks, or let's look at the stress. If the stress is crazy compared to what they've previously been exposed to, maybe it's that. It makes your job easier in the short term, but this is a continually developing process that you need to be aware of all the time. Mm-hmm. And that's why the coach-athlete relationship is so important, because it's a constant feed of information and data that's context dependent, and you need to be able to discern between what's important and what's not, because there's a lot of noise. And it's been described that a bottoms up approach is slowly improving the signal to noise ratio. When you're aware of that, I don't see why you would choose a top down approach at all.
Couple things I want to say is the point you made about I think you referred to it as soft data. I call it interpersonal data. People hear the term data and they think numbers. They think like training volume, which is something that's actually like the thing people immediately think of, by the way, which is like the most archaic data point that we barely.
We'll get back to that.
Data is everything that is involved in the process. This conversation we are having right now is, data, with regards to how I see Connor as a person, So that's something people get really hung up on all the time. They hear about data and they refuse to accept that a conversation can bring more data than any metric that we see on a spreadsheet over a training block. That was the first thing I wanted to say. So I really, really like that point you made. The second thing is that I don't have a problem with top-down approaches. I just want people to be honest, If you are aware of both and you choose a top-down approach, then you have to be honest about what it is that you're offering. You can't say that you're offering a truly individualized training approach, because you're not, and you know that because you're aware of both. If you're naive, well then you're naive, and that's another conversation. But I think it was that RTS put up a blog post, I think it was maybe 6 months ago or so, about running an athlete-centric approach. And your traditional top-down approach, where you give everyone the same, you take 20 athletes, you you give them all the same structure because a competition is in 16 weeks or whatever, but you change variations based on what you perceive them to be weak at. That's not individualization. It's not true individualization. That you are obviously, there's an element of individualization there, but you're not going the full way. So yeah, in short, no problem with the top-down approach. If for logistical reasons it makes the most sense for you, amazing, go for it. But I think it's really disingenuous to try and then compare your services to people who run a bottoms-up approach and try and it's almost a totally different thing. I don't feel like there should even be comparison drawn between the two. Which
yeah, no, I can't argue with that, although I probably did just shit on a top-down approach for the last few minutes. They can certainly be applicable, and if they're constructed on assumptions that you will respond similarly to this group of people that responded this certain way, I mean, it could have merit if, as you say, that's what you're honest about offering. It's not individualized. And this is something I've thought about quite a bit, is at the start of, if you have no data, like you have a lifter who's brand new, the first block kind of needs to be your own top-down approach, because you have nothing to work with, But if you've probably worked with, I'm not even going to put a number on it. You would take, I suppose, the average of their time to peak, their frequencies, this variations that you feel beginners respond really well to. That's technically a top-down approach, for the first 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And then after that, it's, even because the first week you can tell how somebody moves, but it's still bottoms up because you need a starting point somewhere, We're not going to say that, it's only bottoms up if, right, Adam, you've never trained before. Here's one set of squats, one set of bench, and one set of deadlifts, and we're going to see how we get on.
I've had this conversation before with someone, and it's they asked what how you would define a top-down approach versus a bottoms-up approach, and I think the definition of a top-down approach is an approach that has an end goal in mind first and foremost. So you've got a competition or some event that you're training towards in X number of weeks. The training is structured around that time frame first and foremost, Whereas with a bottoms-up approach, our training is structured around the individual, always, Now, don't get me wrong. There's obviously going to be certain cases where, like you mentioned, let's say a lifter joins with us 8 weeks out from competition, We're kind of gated there. That's a weakness of a bottoms-up approach, Ideally, when someone joins, when someone, gets on board, I would love for them to have a 24-week period of nothing, where we can truly just put work in, and run the bottoms-up approach. But I see the comparison you're drawing between our first block with someone new who we have no data on. But it's still bottoms up in nature. We're just constructing the first block based on, I suppose, our set of biases around what works well generally, And something I wanted to talk about, we're talking about real minutia here. It's kind of, if we were to talk about nutrition, you've got the kind of hierarchy of nutrition where obviously adherence is first, and then there's macronutrients, and the pyramid goes on. What we're talking about is somewhere quite close to the top of that pyramid.
Yes.
We're definitely it's the same as the nutritional pyramid. Adherence is number 1. Specificity is number 2. Actually, there's a question here: what basic training principles would you give to someone starting out? There are the scientific principles of strength training, right? Generally speaking, those are what we will start with. But as we go, as we put time in with an individual, we might start to learn things about that individual that will have us reorder those principles ever so slightly, you know, or do something that might not necessarily be totally in line with those scientific principles. But yeah, like if you're listening to this and you're really new to lifting, like really new to lifting, and you're not necessarily ready to start, you know, to get on board with coaching, run a program, run a top-down program. You know, what we're saying is like is minutia at the end of the day, you know, but it's important, you know, when it comes to the coaching process. But at a certain point, you know, there is value still to the top-down approach.
There's a huge difference between something that works and the closer you get to optimal. I'm not going to say optimal because it kind of doesn't exist or it's constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
But the difference between, like, it's, I know they're going to be listening and I know they're going to be pissed at me a little bit, but somebody I train with frequently has this habit of saying that, you know, all roads lead to Rome. With training, it's just like what you enjoy. It's like, yeah, all roads lead to Rome, but some of them get to Rome a lot fucking quicker. You know? And yeah, if you go around this way, you can pick up some cool shit that you can't get if you go straight there. But to say that because they all have the same endpoint, that they're all equal is absurd.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Definitely. I think yeah, I think it really the individual we're talking about, the athlete we're talking about here, really matters with regards to like how effective each kind of each approach is. You know, with a really new athlete, particularly like a young new athlete, a top-down approach and a bottoms-up approach are going to have probably pretty similar effect. You know, no doubt about that. But as you gain more experience, like if you've been in powerlifting for 5 or 6 years, you know, you're maybe coming towards the end of your junior career, that is where the approaches, I think, start to separate out. You know, if you look at like if you take that athlete and you try both approaches on them for 10 years, I think at the end of 10 years the bottoms up approach definitely, which is why we do it, right? We believe in it. But yeah, if you're new and you're listening to this, don't sweat these details. You know, it's nice to hear all this. It's nice to learn, but just lift, right? Just start lifting, keep lifting, and learn as much as you can about yourself. And then when you're thinking about taking the next step, once you've got a little bit of baseline strength and you're looking for a coach, I highly recommend someone who offers a bottoms up approach. Probably my bias talking, though, right?
Yeah, no, I look, I totally agree. And actually, you got me thinking there about this. It's not a question I've had, but it's something I've always been curious of, because you often hear that, or I'd often bump into somebody in a gym or be chatting to them online, and it's like, oh yeah, I was really looking to join up. I just wanted to get to this level of strength first, and then I'd sign up. And it's like, why? Like you're there to get stronger. I'm not sure what the issue is there. And something you said there about, look, do your own bits, have a crack at any program, and develop a certain level of strength. What do you think of that? Like, really, if somebody is saying, oh, I don't know if I'm strong enough to join Odyssey, which is a super common thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's generally a pretty problematic thing to say, right? If you've never lifted before, like you literally haven't touched a barbell, maybe there's some something there. You know, maybe you're right. Maybe you need to go and you need to do a bit of training, and you need to see if it's something that you like, something you enjoy, something you want to do long term, and then come back to us. You know, but if you've been lifting for, you know, whatever, a year, you're fairly new, your numbers aren't like what you think to be good. That's it's based. I think social media has a lot to answer for there, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Places a lot of these expectations in people's minds that they need to be at this level before they compete. Absolutely not. Like once you've bridged the gap between like total beginner, you have absolutely no idea what the sport entails. You're one of these people who says, "Oh, that's powerlifting," yeah. Once you've gotten over that hurdle, you're ready. You're ready to jump in on the process. But I think, again, just being completely honest, if you're that person, you're probably going to get similar results in the short term, in the immediate, by running Johnny Candido's 16-week program or running our bottoms-up approach. But after 5 years of doing both things, I know which one I'd bet on having the better results.
Absolutely. If I can, I think what you meant originally when you said, look, if you're brand new to it, just do X before you start thinking about this. Would I be right in saying that before you start trying to figure out how you respond to training, you have to train?
Yeah.
Before you start thinking, now I wonder what my optimal frequency is, or what my total number of sets per week that's good for me is, like, well, you've never been in a gym. Mm-hmm. So do that first and come back to me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I've got a couple more questions here. Unless you've got anything you want to throw out there.
Nope.
Fire on. Cool. So this is an interesting one. Do you believe manifestation is something athletes should use in their training?
I would ask, I'm going to assume what is meant by manifestations. Do you mean like visualization and saying, right, I'm in here on the lift, I have this amount on the bar, that kind of thing? Is that what you think is being said?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
I mean, you can. I haven't done much of it myself, or I don't know much about it. But I've heard people picturing what it's like not to have a certain amount of weight on the bar. I've heard people thinking it over in themselves to know what it's like to feel super comfortable under a bar, the position that you want to be in, and nearly rehearsing cues so that by the time you get under the bar, you can recognize, right, this is the position I want to be in, or these are the cues that I'm focusing on. This is how I feel with it. Absolutely, yeah. If you can do that, I think it's potentially beneficial. And we've actually, now that I think of it, we've spoken about this not so long ago, that it's not that, I can feel 300 kilos on my back, I'm going to squat this next week. It's more about feeling what a good position is for you and like rehearsing that in your head. I think that can be a very valuable thing.
I agree. I think visualization is one of the most complex things to discuss with regards to powerlifting training, because it is entirely individual. It's so nuanced. Like how you will visualize versus how I will visualize are like extremely difficult things to compare, and they're even difficult to try and talk about, to try and get across.
Even
your
try
own
and articulate, like you're trying
exactly.
to, because it's a feeling, not a description.
Exactly. What you said there, though, is generally how, like, if someone has no experience of visualization, they haven't even tried to apply that to their training. Generally, what I will advise is that you think about the sensations that you feel during training. Think about the sensations that come up a lot. So for me, the feeling, like in a back squat, the feeling of the knurling on my back when the bar is in that perfect position. That's something, when I'm sitting there drinking my, pre-training coffee or whatever, that's something that I find myself thinking about. Will that work for you? I don't know. Hope maybe, try it, right? But yeah, I think to take the question literally, which is, do you believe manifestation is something athletes use in training? If you meant it literally, like if I, think about this 300 kilo squat, I'll manifest it into existence. No, I think you're probably wasting your time. But I definitely do think visualization in some respect. However you feel it works. Some people, get mental hype and are pacing around themselves around the room, thinking about how the lift will feel, and literally in their brain watching themselves perform this lift 1,000 times. Hey, if that works for you, amazing, go for it. Doesn't work at all for me. I've tried it and I feel stupid every time.
It's like building confidence for yourself,
Exactly.
isn't it? It's like when you think about, like, when I went to my first competition, when I got under the bar, I was like, how the fuck do you do this? But it's just another rep. And then every competition afterwards that I've gone to and said, I fucking do this all day, every day. There's nothing to it. So I suppose if you have a big, like, a test coming and you have this number in your head, to say that you've loaded and done this in your mind hundreds or thousands of times beforehand, I suppose can be a nice confidence boost, Whereas if it's brand new to you and you're seeing it on the bar for the first time, you haven't even begun to fucking process it, it might seem like, what the fuck am I doing here? I think in that way it can be beneficial, having thought about it a little bit more. And I know I'd said maybe not with specific weights, but maybe.
Be dynamic, right? Like everything, this is going to be dynamic. This is probably how you visualize now is probably going to be different to how you visualize in 10 years, as you gain 10 years worth of other life experiences that ultimately change who you are as a person. Be dynamic. Don't be afraid to try, and don't be afraid to fail, because ultimately, that's how we'll evolve the process. That's how we'll figure out what works in the moment, what works when we need to call on it to work. Such as competition, things like that. For me, I've got a decent bit of experience now. I know that, like, screaming and shouting beforehand and like watching myself doing is not gonna work for me that consistently. So I try to practice what I have felt works well. But don't be afraid to try something new. And look, don't be afraid to sit there and think about that 300 kilo squat. Don't be afraid to try it. I think it's probably pretty useless, but don't be afraid to try. You can only fail, and like with something like this, what are we talking about? You might lose a little bit of time. It's definitely worth failing to know that this thing doesn't work for you, to add another tool to your kit.
Failure is data.
Yeah,
I think
always.
failure is unbelievably important in almost anything. It's unbelievably inevitable anyway, so fucking get over that anyway. But
Mhm.
if you can learn from it, it is amazing.
I just put up a post on the Instagram yesterday about Andrew Rowe. I feel like we're going to talk about this guy every episode, but he'll be a guest at some point, so he can talk about himself. That's his favorite thing to do. Um, um, like the last year of Andrew's training, if you looked at it on paper, you would think, wow, that was a terrible year of training. But if you talk to both me and Andrew, I'm Andrew's coach, um, it's been the best year. It's been the most valuable year. We have learned what feels like to me 10 years worth of of things about Andrew, and how Andrew operates as a lifter, and what works well and what doesn't work well for him. Through these negative experiences, through these failures, you know, um, they have been by far the most valuable experiences of our time working together. And we both admit that he, right now, after this last year of hardship, is the best version of himself. And we're ready to our trajectory now, even though we've had a year off, I guess, right? Our trajectory, but we both agree, is much higher than it was if we were following the line we were following before, because we had never experienced failure. We didn't know what worked, because we didn't know what didn't work. And it's that's the most recent case where I can actually call on an example. But like in all of my coaching experience, failure has been so crucial to future success.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important thing for anyone who's going through bad training, or maybe a bout of injury at the minute, because it can be so demoralizing and it can feel that you're never going to get out of this. But for somebody to hear that a national level athlete had the best training year of his life being injured is amazing. And you definitely can do it by yourself. But this is where I feel it's super important to have a coach who's willing to work with you through this time, not somebody who's like, oh well, that's shit about your back. Give us a text when it feels better and we'll train again. You know, you need to have somebody who's willing to spend time working with you, somebody who can manage your, not they can't manage your pain, but they can work with you on it, as we alluded to in the last episode. It's imperative. You know, I've known like Andy as a coach has these experiences himself and he has the information necessary. But I wonder in what position would he be in if it wasn't for you working with him?
Yeah, I mean, like we can talk about this. Is something we said we were going to talk about. What it's like for coaches working with coaches. That's something we're going to talk about. But I guess he'd probably, like, I'm really bad for not taking any form of compliment ever, right? But he'd probably objectively be in a worse spot because he wouldn't be able to apply the objectivity to his situation that I can apply to his situation.
Absolutely.
That's the beauty of having a coach, you know? And I'm sure every single person listening to this who has, you know, a couple of years experience with powerlifting knows the feeling of things not going your way and you kind of being blinded by yourself and your own expectation, you know? And if you've had someone, hopefully a really good coach, come in and apply a little bit of context, perspective, and objectivity to that situation, you know how valuable that is, you know? And this is why, beyond your, you know, your introduction to lifting and the sport of powerlifting and training, like you said, this is why every successful athlete and every successful coach, the first advice they will give to a newer lifter is get a coach. Get yourself a coach. Apply some objectivity to your training, to your situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Okay, we've got another question here. So the next one is, would you recommend core exercises for someone who relies too heavily on their belt?
I really wish we had these people with us because I'd like to know by what metric you're saying you're relying on your belt too much, you know? And if you let me kind of just run with this, what are you trying to do in training? Are you trying to squat the most amount of weight? And if you mean that you're relying on your belt, that the belt gives you a lot more than you could do beltless, who cares? Who the fuck cares? You know, you're there to lift the most amount of weight. You're allowed to use a belt. If it gives you more weight for whatever reason, fucking do it. You know? That being said, if there is a big discrepancy between somebody who lifts when they're wearing a belt and when they're not, if the belt is really good, and I even use it with beginners, like as a personal trainer for people who are just learning how to squat, because it's super valuable in learning how to brace because there's a reference point, there's something to push against, and it's not a very intuitive or natural thing to say, you know, whatever cue you want to give to brace your core. People are like, where the fuck are my hips? Like, what are you? It's a really hard reference point to work with. But if you say, fill this belt, push out against it, people can say, all right, this is the kind of tension that I like to be building. And to circle back to my point, I suppose, is if you find that you can use a belt well, i.e. get more weight out of your squat with it on, than you can without it, that probably means you're not very good at bracing. You're relying on this belt. If you rather taught somebody how to use the musculature of their core, they would probably get much better squatting without a belt. If you want to count that as a core exercise or not, I don't know. What do you think? Did I make even a concrete point there? I kind of went around in a few circles.
You made 3/4 of a concrete point anyway.
I'm okay with that.
I mean, sometimes, you know, like, It's a complex thing. Generally, I like to take the smallest intervention possible to any issue, the smallest effective intervention.
Mm.
So like, again, if we take the question at face value, someone who relies on their belts, like the reason you wear a belt is to rely on it in some sense. Like, rely on it to what? Add 5 kilos to your lift? There's no problem there, you know. Like, that's why we're wearing a belt. Now, if you mean like they have some underlying issue, right? That there does exist some underlying issue, then yeah, sure. Sometimes core exercises can really help. Things that usually dynamic exercises that teach you more about the musculature we're talking about, teach you more about how to use the musculature that's relevant to the competition, squat, bench press, and deadlift. Does that mean you need to be able to do, like, you know, really heavy weighted planks, or like really heavy Russian twists, or some other exercise? No, like I've achieved what we're talking about here with a few dead bugs. You know, an exercise that teaches you the fundamental principles of bracing, and teaches you the feelings that you should be feeling when we're talking about bracing. You know, once you understand those things, then we'll throw the belt back on. You know, so if that weakness or if that lack of understanding of bracing does exist, then yeah, like sometimes I use a dead bug. Sometimes we might go beltless, so you can kind of bridge the gap between the dead bug and the squat and the comp squat. But I don't think, like, adding core work to your training is an intervention. You know, you're adding it for some purpose, for some reason. You know, if someone doesn't present with some form of issue that suggests core work is necessary, then I'm not going to add core work to their training. You know, it's that simple. People have finite amounts of time. People forget this all the time. You know, if I've given you, if I presented you with a 2-hour training session, I'm not like, it's very rare I'm going to be like, you know what, I'm going to just throw 20 minutes of core work on top of that because I think so. You know, no. But yeah, again, in short, to answer your question, would you recommend core exercises for someone who relies on their belt? If you have the right set of eyes on the issue you're talking about, yeah, sometimes I would recommend it. But generally you're supposed to rely on your belts. Like, that's what we're doing here. You know, it's like you could ask the same thing about knee sleeves or wrist wraps. You know, if wrist wraps help you bench press more weight, what's the problem? We're bench pressing more weight. If an issue arises, a visible, concrete, solid issue, then yeah, then we'll look to address it through you know, some means. But if there's no issue, don't try and fix it.
I had a similar question posed to me on Instagram recently. It's like, I always kind of lean forward in my squat. How do I fix this? And my counter question was, what's the problem? You know, like, if you can squat more weight with it and it doesn't feel shit and you're otherwise grand, what's the problem? You're allowed to lean over. You know,
consistent, repeatable, unconscious. Those are the pillars of movement that we look for. We're not looking for an aesthetic, you know, and oftentimes people fall down in that they're chasing the aesthetic of their favorite lifter. You know, they're looking to lift exactly how their favorite super strong lifter lifts. You know, but people are different. You know, your biomechanics are what will dictate how you lift, and that aesthetic is different. You know, so like, man, when you hear people say about someone who leans over in their squat, he's using way too much back. Like, what you're saying actually to the initiated is, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Like, you know, it's look, there are fundamentals that we're looking to achieve, to satisfy, right? We're looking to, usually we want the bar to be over midline with the body when we're squatting. Some people are going to have to lean over to make that happen. Some people are going to be very upright. If the bar is over midline, give or take a few degrees, because again, we're human and we move funny and we make mistakes, then we're good. If that lifter is, let's say, a centimeter over midline and they're leaning over, right? But they're so consistent with it. Every rep is repeatable, right? Everything they do is the same, and they're totally unconscious. You are doing a huge disservice to that lifter by getting involved and making an intervention with how they're moving there, because and the literature supports this. Unconscious movement usually is very good movement with regards to high level strength athletes. And so that's something we've talked about at length. Something we combat all the time is this aesthetic approach to movement. Keep the goal. We're trying to move as much weight as possible here. We're not trying to look a certain way while doing it.
Yeah, that's one thing I get very unhinged on, is when people start talking about these things. So you answered that very nicely.
I think a good closing topic would be what it's like for coaches to coach coaches. And I know you said you were discussing this with another coach in a different discipline. So I'll let you take the lead on that one.
Yeah, so I suppose it came from my assumption that coaching somebody else who understands the position we're in would be easier. That they would know what the story is, they would know what's necessary, and they'd be more willing to come along with the more boring or monotonous parts of the training experience. And you coach me and I coach you. And I know for an absolute fact we are not our easiest clients. As much of a surprise as that might be. And it kind of struck me, and being a personal trainer as well to the general population, is that it's not a knowledge gap, or at least a knowledge availability gap. Like, you could, if you were just this random gym goer, you could get a savage program online and just work away at it, and you could see, as we said earlier on, from a top-down approach, you can see good results. But that's not why people get a coach for the most part. Like, yes, there is specific and directed knowledge, but people get a coach for reassurance, direction, accountability. And I think that's why the coach-athlete relationship matters so much, Would you agree? And I suppose bringing it back to the differences between coaching a fellow coach and coaching an athlete is you still have to do the thing. You still have to hold their hand. You still have to give them direction. You still have to console them. You still have to motivate them at times, and it's generally no different. And we spoke very briefly about this before we started, and I think you said that, right? It's no different. You're still coaching a human being who is completely unique and is able to fucking change completely. Like, this is our 5th year of working together, Matt, right?
Insane,
Would you say that I've changed in those 5 years?
A little bit. Substantially, yeah. You obviously 5 years ago you were, what, 18?
Mm-hmm.
Man, that's nuts, isn't it?
I mean, I'm 23 now. 5 years ago.
Yeah. Crazy.
No, but even when I think back on, even in recent times, things that I was so sure about that I've changed my mind on, and that's in the time period since I've been a trainer. Take it back another 3 years to when I was just some lad. I fucking cringe looking back on the things that I swore was true, or vehemently fucking promoted to my friends who weren't gym goers, who were like, fuck this guy. Yeah. That makes so much sense. It's like, no, lordosis is generally not responsible for lower back pain. And a whole host of other things that I'll probably get as nightmares in my fucking later years.
This is why this is something a friend of mine, Ray, has said to me in the past. This is why memories on social media are actually a blessing in disguise, because they highlight the dumbest of the shit that you said, and you could very, very quickly just go in, delete. Well, no, like we said earlier, like, these are failures or mistakes, right, that ultimately shaped who you are today, right? And
Absolutely, yeah.
I like who you are.
Thank you.
You know, I think you like who you are too, right?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. Yeah.
Ultimately, you would not be this person had you not said some of the, and trust me, he said some really dumb shit. Hey, don't get me wrong, I've said some of the dumbest shit I've ever heard in my entire life. But that's how it is, you know? And that's how we learn and evolve and grow and whatnot. But to circle back to what you were saying about the coaching coaches, yeah, I fully agree. Like, you're at the end of the day, you're coaching another person, you know? And I think if you are a coach and you train in whatever discipline it is that you coach, you know that your coach brain and your athlete brain are probably different things. You know, I've been coaching for a long enough time now, 5 or 6 years, and I'm a very different athlete and coach. You know, I have different personality traits that influence different things because of the presence of objectivity and lack thereof when you're the athlete, you know. So yeah, it's an interesting process. I would love if anyone listening is a coach, who coaches a coach, or vice versa, if you're a coach who's being coached by a coach, I'd love if you would share your thoughts in the comments or via, you know, personal message or whatever. I'd love to hear what you guys think, because I coach 4 coaches. And there's no similarity there at all. You know, there's nothing to do with coaching them that is caused by them being a coach that is the same across all 4. You know, it's they're just athletes at the end of the day. You know, and that's how I think it's very important, if you're a coach coaching a coach, that you don't come into it with this preconceived notion that this is going to be any easier experience than just coaching a normal person, because you're setting yourself up for harsh
heartbreak.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Is there anything you wanted to discuss before we close this out?
No short points. I know there was a question or a prompt left there that would have set me off on one entirely, and I felt with a few points we were going to talk about what pisses me off, but fuck yeah, that's a long that's a long podcast.
We'll have to put maybe 2 or 3 episodes towards that.
Nice.
At some point in the future.
Great. Yeah, venting.
Awesome. Well, that was fantastic. There was minimal technical difficulties this time around, so we're already improving. Again, like last time, guys, we really, really appreciate it. You watching. If there's anything you would like us to talk about, please let us know. Don't be afraid to subscribe. If you subscribe, you'll see our videos as they come out. And yeah, we really appreciate you guys. We'll be back for another one within the next 7 days. Take it easy.
All the best.